we really need industry professionals who are seeing that kind of thing, those kind of products, these unexpected consequences, to be raising those issues either with officials or with the politicians who are in charge of it.
Clima inspires and educates people to create healthy, durable and energy-efficient buildings to live, learn, work and play in. Welcome to the Clima podcast. Today we speak with Arena Williams, MP for Manurewa and spokesperson for Commerce and Consumer Affairs, Building and Construction and Youth. In this interview, we discuss the Overseas Product Register and unconsented granny flats, as well as learning more about Arena's goals for her time in Parliament. So, Arena, the house that I live in at the moment is probably like about 1.5 million of our New Zealand homes, where no insulation in the walls was built in 1969. Pretty cold and drafty. What was the house like that you grew up in?
Yeah, I had a similar experience growing up in South Auckland. So much of our housing stock around the area is exactly the same, and actually the house that I live in too. And when I think about the changes that we could make as New Zealanders for not only the quality of buildings, but also for the young people growing up in these homes, and for many of the health problems that our kids are dealing with, it's asthma, it's the common colds that we get through the winter that we feel very strongly in our populations. Insulation's got to be one of those interventions that would make a big difference. Not to mention the difference for the cost of living for people at the moment with that rising, the difference we could make to people's power bills and to people's bills for things like medicines and other things which they're shelling out for because we're not doing that upfront intervention. I really believe that it is a role of government to make sure that people not only understand the importance of having the insulation, but also have access to it. So making those things part of the standard way that we build and changing the culture around it, as well as incentivising it within the building system and within the electricity system, frankly.
Now, looking back at your sort of path, you studied law, is that right?
Yep. Oh, you got me.
What was exciting about law?
I, as a high school student, was really passionate about politics, but also social justice issues. One of the first things that I ever got involved with at a community project level was because my local MP, Nanaia Mahuta, was campaigning on issues for Māori and the rights of hapu and iwi groups to their natural environment and to beaches and their foreshore. And so for me, getting involved in that, I was 15 and I saw the power of someone to not only organise within the community about these issues, but also to push back within our democratic system. And so I got involved in her local campaigning and got more young people around me involved. And so by the time I got to university, I had a great skill set of being able to bring people along into something bigger than just them, but for their community. I also grew up in a house with my father was a local counsellor and my mum a local GP, and a lot of my childhood had been sitting around the kitchen table on a Sunday having people from the community coming in and talking to them about the way that they wanted to make changes in the community. And law seemed to me, when I studied it, to be a way of not only making sure that the rules were for people and were being applied fairly, but that also that they were designed in a way that was actually fair overall. And the connection between law and politics for me is that it's about making sure that everyone has access to justice, everyone has access to a fair system, and that the kind of choices that politicians make are fair for everyone and work out so that we can have both a prosperous economy and people sharing in that.
So once you'd finished law, how did you then transition into politics?
I mean, it's not a natural one. And to anyone who's listening to this, who's thinking of themselves as like someone with technical expertise, that is what I really quickly became. In that period, straight out of law school, I was practicing in commercial law. I was working with big corporate entities on their commercial governance. And this was a technical field where I really benefited from some intense training around just how to get to the bottom of an issue. That sort of deep thinking, but narrow thinking, that does not lend itself to politics, where you have to sort of spin around a number of issues at a more surface level and be able to communicate things very quickly. But the connection there for me is that I learnt to be able to distill information really quickly and be able to decide, using my judgment and using the skills that I had picked up to learn very quickly, how these rules are affecting people and the real world implication of that. When you're a lawyer, you can spend a lot of time in the clouds thinking about how laws affect people in a very removed way, or you can get right down to the facts and say, who are the winners here? Who are the losers here? What will be the impact of this? And that really helps in politics. I'm constantly challenging myself to think about who are the people who will lose out of change and what will the effect be in the long term on our communities if we have a group of people who are losing.
Can you give us an example of that from the earliest times in your political career where you were, targeting things which were very clearly imbalanced? Is there one example that you can pull out?
Yeah, well, I think about a issue that I dealt with in my university days, and this wasn't when I was involved in politics, but I just graduated with my law degree, right? And I think I was 23. And my auntie from Gisborne rang me up, and what had happened is my absolutely beloved nephew, I'm so proud of this guy, he was at the time the male leader of his kapahaka group. It's a very, very successful kapahaka group that often wins the regionals and has recently been up in the top 5 performers at Te Matatini. He's a legend, but he's also someone who went through the school system and did not learn to read. He is one of the many young Māori men who had graduated and with lots and lots of great skills, but not that skill. And one night they were coming home with him and a group of friends from a kapahaka practice, and it was about 1 a.m. because those guys, they drive it hard. And they were pulled over by a policeman, and the car was searched for drugs, and drugs were found in the back of the car. And my nephew, being not only the leader of the kapahaka group, but the stellar leader that he is, absolutely put his hand up and said, yep, it's me, take me away. And before he was able to properly contact not only his family but some representation, he had agreed to all of the charges. And there's a real difference between explaining this to someone like you or me and explaining it, especially on a charge sheet that is written down in relatively difficult English, to someone who doesn't have any literacy skills whatsoever. I'm talking about a guy who can't really send a text message. So for me, that was a real moment where I also realised that I was the best person that he had to call, that my auntie in Gisborne had so little access to the justice system that the 23-year-old newly graduated lawyer was the most informed person that we had access to. And at that point, I sort of thought to myself, actually, this isn't the law working well, and the reason behind these rules makes sense. But when it's being applied in this way, and when it's being, the effect of it is that young men like my nephew bearing the brunt of something which isn't working well, then we've got to say that this law is not working. So that really motivated me, made me want to not only be a lawyer in the system working with the rules as they were, but also made me want to look at this and think about how we would make a change.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking more broadly about the literacy across our country. It's affected by health.
Absolutely.
And our part in that as a company, as our skill set is to improve building outcome, building quality for health, because that is a driver of, or a controller of, the amount of education that you attain.
You're so right.
And that's a really interesting connection that we don't really think about that much.
You wonder about someone like him or his many friends who also went through high school and had a really rough time. How many was because their ears were blocked and they were having hearing issues? How many of them were missing days of school because their asthma was really out of control and they were getting colds and things like flus in the wintertime that was meaning they were missing weeks, if not months, of their formal education? By the time he got to the end of school, he believed that he was bad at school. But this is a guy who is incredibly talented in so many other things. And so if we don't make those upfront investments in people's housing, but also in the education that goes along with that for parents and the kind of environments that we're raising our kids in, then we will continue to see these outcomes where there is growing inequality.
And the data, so behind all of this stuff is there. And you talk about digging deep into an issue and understanding an issue. That's the problem, right? We've got so much data which supports, but who's pulling it all together? I know the Asthma Foundation have got some very specific data about education related to asthma. So if you're off school, it affects, all of that stuff is there. And I'm just wondering how that's pulled together to not just for more knowledge, but to actually make a difference in the decision-making, the urgency for changing housing, for changing, expectation of what housing is, for changing expectation. I'm hesitant to say, let's write a law which says a building must be 20 degrees all of the time. That doesn't work. I know that doesn't work, but we've got to target that somehow. What's your take on that? Is that one person? Is it one party? Is it everybody?
I think I want to come back to what I said about anyone technical who's listening to this and thinking well, my technical expertise don't line up with politics when you're seeing just this week in politics, a number of laws being rushed through that don't seem to make sense to people beyond the sort of Wellington bubble. But I want to say to those people, the technical expertise, you have to make it line up with what's retail politics. We have to explain it to people in terms if houses aren't insulated and if we miss an opportunity to make sure new builds aren't built to best practice, they're warm, they're dry, then we will continue to entrench exactly those factors, which mean that more young people are coming out of school ill-prepared for the workforce, they're ill-prepared for just the way that the world is changing now, and we're setting ourselves backwards as a country. If we want to enjoy the things that the countries that we like to compare ourselves to, there's European countries, the United States, the Australia, we need to make sure that our kids are growing up in warm, dry environments and that they're getting the best out of school. And I'd say as well that bringing those things together, it's not a matter of making the information the most accurate or winning the argument in terms of the technical points. It's helping people to understand just how urgent that is as well as not only a political and legal challenge, but also one of morality.
So on the opportunity to change, you're currently with the party which is in opposition.
Mm-hmm.
How do you manage that expectation of change and progress with being in opposition? What's that balance? Because it must be pretty challenging most days to see things, to want to challenge, but actually there's some of those things are good. What's that balance? What does it look like for you?
We've got a great opportunity at the moment where both Labour and National share a lot of the same goals in terms of the building system. We want to see more abundant housing. We want to see the layers of protectionism removed so that we can build faster, we can build better. I think my job in this is making sure that as the government takes its approach, which is using many of the tools of deregulation to bring that online faster, that we're making sure our bottom lines are met whereby homeowners and the little guy aren't left carrying the can from that. And so where we would differ is Labour would always centre sort of the homeowners in that system, would make sure that there are protections, whether that's insurance, whether that's levies, whether there is schemes that we can make sure people who are least able to enforce their rights are able to do that. And that's where the policy work has to be for me. But at the same time, a lot of the changes that we see the national government doing, it's not where we would have started with a system. But if they're going to take it on, all the power to them, let's make sure they do it right.
In the middle of your answer just there, you used the word deregulation. Now, we know that the building industry deregulated quite substantially in the 80s with really tragic outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
What are your controls around that?
I'm worried about that we would see ourselves in another situation like the leaky buildings crisis, which cost New Zealand's economy more than $20 billion overall. It cost the government more than $10 billion for a number of payouts around local government and around the liabilities that were created through that system. It's a real worry. However, we also need to look at the cost of building rising in New Zealand and say it shouldn't cost more than it does in Australia to build these homes, let alone a number of times more. There's got to be some balance here that we make sure we're using the right kind of rules and regulations to get better outcomes. And when I look at the problem that's in front of us, I think that's an opportunity. If we both agree that we want things to move faster, that we want to build more homes, then how do we use this political moment where we're in alignment to make sure that we're actually building better and that we're not only building more houses, but those houses are of a higher quality? That's where I see opportunities around overseas building products. Yes, there's a worry there that kind of deregulation will mean that there are cheaper, shoddier products in our market and they're not used well. But if we can get this right, we can also open up to innovation and make sure that the products in the market are not only driving change in our building system here, but are changing the practices that we use too in the industry, and that there is a forced upskilling going on with education too.
A forced upskilling. Give us that. Explain that. I get it, but explain that.
Well, I hope that with more products being available and more access to other products, not only consumers understand their choices better and that there is a greater range of choice for people who are seeking to build in different ways in New Zealand, but I also hope that builders are taking on the opportunity to use different sorts of products and offer a greater range of services in New Zealand. I think it will also challenge our industry. I really want to see us using things like more prefabrication and more off-site building. This has been something that's been going on in New Zealand for a long time. It's not new to us, but that ability to scale depends on our workforce and the ability of more builders, and especially more of the small to medium-sized builders, being able to use some of these techniques.
Yeah, and just that whole thing around prefabrication. Unfortunately, Clevercore, the company, have just sort of closed up or reduced down what they're doing. And part of that, of course, is because of the pullback in spending. With that pullback in spending around social housing, that's affected a lot of companies. It affects us too with our product supply into those projects. What's your understanding of that? And then what can you do to manage that or improve or just stop that? I was going to call it rot. Maybe that's a bit far.
I'm gutted about the closure of Clima. It's in my electorate in Manurewa. It's an important part of the ecosystem of manufacture in Manukau, which is the country's manufacturing hub. I see that as a real wasted opportunity when prefabrication in the New Zealand market could be scaling up, or in fact scaling it back. That's the wrong direction. It also has a big impact on jobs, and it is leading to, I guess, a conservative attitude around investment from some of those big companies that could be pushing out into innovation in the building sector, but are in fact not able to do that because of an uncertain pipeline of work from the big builders like Aotearoa, because public housing is all frozen. There's a wasted opportunity as well from the government, because we've seen 14,000 construction workers gone offshore since the day they took office. I think in a time where the building sector is struggling, that it is the role of government to act as a ballast, because we know that for countries like the UK that have also seen this kind of downturn in the house building sector, that it takes longer, that there's a lag in that sector getting back on its feet when economic conditions change and when we're back to a build cycle. We will then heat up demand for housing without a workforce able to deliver it, and so prices increase rapidly. That's the opposite of what we're now trying to do, which is to recognise that abundant housing is the answer, and that we're trying to bring down the price of housing through supply-side measures. It's really incumbent on the government to make sure that they've got some infrastructure pipeline, big set pieces in the works. They've said they are going to do that, so we're watching with bated breath. I wish it was in the house building side. I wish that the government had invested into public housing when New Zealanders need it, when the state is a very good provider of housing in New Zealand, but that's not their priority. So let's see what else is there for our building and construction sector now.
So currently we've got this idea around unconsented granny flats. Mm-hmm. Now, this is obviously a way of getting more accommodation, but what sort of risks are associated with this?
Great question, and one I've been thinking about too, because we tentatively support those measures. also wouldn't have been the first thing on our agenda to house more people. But if there is a real need there for granny flats for older people or for extended family to be able to stay together, then let's see how that goes. But there is a downside. Councils have rightly pointed to the worry that without the ability to consent, they are also not involved in connecting to utilities, to planning for those extra homes. And you might imagine this in a street of 10 houses. If you then introduce another 10 houses in the back of them through granny flats, you've got double the need for the utilities, double the need for parking, double the need for access to the local libraries and the local schools. And if we're not willing to fund that infrastructure through the traditional mechanisms that you would need to pay if you were consented, then the government needs to come to the party for that. Or we won't have access to those things. And the government sort of excuses this by saying, well, we're going for growth. But that growth can't come at the expense of the communities that need these services and access them constantly and are going to be put under pressure by this. Growth should be about making life better for everyone. It shouldn't be at the expense of those things that communities need to make them great places to live.
Of course. Now, just having a look at the bigger picture, we spoke earlier about the importance of insulation, but there's also a whole lot of other areas. Of course, there's ventilation. There's also things about how does the building actually perform? And there's talk at the moment of further changes now to H1, where they're looking at doing away with the schedule method and moving to either the calculation or the modelling method.
Yeah.
Now, with regards, we're a big supporter of modelling because we feel this is actually producing a model that can tell you, is the house going to overheat in summer? These sort of important things. Now, currently there's a number of sort of schemes around Homestar, Passive House, various different schemes for looking at the performance of buildings, but there's no requirement from government at the moment to say this is how our houses should be performing. So what are your thoughts? Should there be a compulsory sort of a scheme, or are we going to wait for the community to slowly take up these existing voluntary schemes?
I'm also a supporter of the modelling method. I think that would be a really useful way for the industry to use the tools that are rapidly becoming cheaper and more available to sensibly measure not only the effective insulation, but also the effective ventilation. Just where you're going to put things like vents and windows makes a massive difference to the design, but also in context of where something is built and where the sun is in relation to those things. And so I would love to see the industry adopting that. I would also like government to be leading out on how those standards should be applied, because everyone needs to use the same standards and the same testing. Because if we want these things to work, they need to apply equally to everyone across the board. And if we went for a model where the industry was meant to pick it up piecemeal, we would see some builders adopting that to their cost and then others outcompeting them in a market where we're got a clear government signal that the price of building is too much, so that every cost saving is going to be really important. We'll then also see a sort of race to the bottom on some of these things. The problem with that is that it costs more in the long run. So I would like to see the government introducing some sort of standard that works for builders in the market that needs to be complied with for the kind of testing and the way that this is then reported into the consenting process.
Now, another thing that we've seen coming in is the remote building inspection program. Do you think this is something that's going to save us money, or could it be a dog's breakfast?
It's an interesting one, and I've met with a number of industry professionals on this who have lots of different views. I'm not an expert on the way that these reviews work, but what I do know is that a number of councils have been using them for a long time. They're a really useful part of their process already. So the government writing out and saying, well, this is going to be the solution to save money and this is going to be the solution to speed things up, doesn't necessarily reflect the situation now. We're not going to see massive efficiencies in Auckland because Auckland Council is a council that is using these really effectively for the kinds of builds where they see as a low risk option and a useful option. Where I think we could be seeing more gains is where council are given a clearer indication from the government about what liability they should be holding. I have raised this with the Minister a number of times publicly and, working constructively with his officials, that I think what we're getting to here is that often there is an over-reliance on councils' roles in checking and consenting. And so if there was a clearer steer on the liability of councils where something does go wrong, then that would be the way to drive efficiencies in that end of the process.
And we spoke earlier about deregulation. Now, one of the areas that's changing is the Overseas Products Register. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, this is a massive task, isn't it, to try and look at all these different products around the world and try and work out which ones are going to be complying with the code. And how does this also affect existing manufacturers who've obviously invested in things like brands appraisals and code marks? What are your thoughts there?
That is a very difficult task. And one of the reasons why it is an incredibly difficult task is that, and the teams who are responsible for this work are also part of the cuts to the public service. So they've lost a number of personnel within the department who are charged with this. So a very difficult task for those public servants, and something I'm very invested in them getting right. I think that there are a number of industry professionals who actually do this work constantly and should be brought into some of this. I think there is specialist expertise here that we need to be using. I'd also say, when it comes to the actual technical reading that's involved in making sure that the standards that we would apply in New Zealand from overseas are the right standards and are right for our environment, that is going to take longer than what has been suggested in the media. It's just unrealistic to make sure that the standards that are being used here are going to fit with our environment. Take, for example, standards that we might see as ordinary in somewhere like Singapore. The humidity levels there that the products have been tested for will mean that translating them into the New Zealand context means they have to be retested. The testing is also testing for something different. It's, where the wet air is and where the dry air is on different sides of the envelope in a New Zealand context. And so we're going to need to do that work really carefully. And I think within government, MB is absolutely taken on that task and good on them, but they're going to need to draw on industry expertise. We had Labour stepping out and bringing industry closer to government through things like the Building Sector Accord. This government has cut that. They disagreed with its efficacy. I think it was a great move, but they're going to need to set something like that up where they've got industry working alongside them really closely. I'd also mention that I get manufacturers coming to me and saying, I thought that the new rules were going to help me with my product, and my product is, I think, not going to be allowed into the country, and I need some help with that because I think this is wrong for all of these reasons. That side is probably being dealt with quite well. What's not being dealt with well is the reverse of that the standards are so liberal that we're going to see products that we probably didn't intend to be widely available in the New Zealand market here, but that's not being raised up by anyone because there's not a financial incentive to do so. So we really need industry professionals who are seeing that kind of thing, those kind of products, these unexpected consequences, to be raising those issues either with officials or with the politicians who are in charge of it. The nice thing about New Zealand's democracy is that both me and the Minister are very accessible and open and easy to contact through our parliamentary email addresses. So if you've seen one of those funny ones where you think this is an unintended consequence of the liberalisation and the deregulation, please get in touch and let us know so we can fix it now and not in 10 years when the wall is leaking.
You're talking our language. As soon as you started talking about moisture and which way which side of the wall moisture is on and what those drives are, that's our language. That's encouraging me. What I'm interested to is where you go for good information around that kind of thing, around the building envelope, which you actually named as the building envelope. So I'm just very happy that you are understanding even some of that language that we as an industry use. So I'm congratulating you, and it sounds fractionally condescending, and it's far, far away from that.
It's not my expertise, naturally.
But you've started that understanding, and you're the spokesperson for building and construction for the Labour Party, and that's brilliant, and I applaud you for that. The thing that we just talked about was largely around products, and that is what this is, right? This Overseas Products Register, and that's the starting point. One of the challenges is what those products do with each other, to each other, in combination, in systems.
Yeah.
Again, where do you go for that information at the moment?
Well, you know where I got the Singapore example? I have recently been to Singapore, and the reason I know a little bit about that is I got to meet with one of the infrastructure builders there about the way that they are approaching some of these challenges. The Singapore government has invested $10 billion in one of its public transport builds, but that goes along with a number of new buildings that they are thinking about how to make them not only environmentally friendly, but also resistant to climate change in a very small island nation, not dissimilar to ours in terms of the risks that they face with their building. And I got to think about this economy, which, unlike ours, is a taker of products. They import almost all of their building products and have a very liberalised system about the way that they use those products, but also then a very controlled system about how they are used in their systems. So that was really helpful for me to think about, well, if you're going to deregulate the way that products come into the market and the range of products that are on offer, how do you then sensibly limit the way that those products are used? And then that is something that Singapore has got right, I think, and could be an example for us.
So somebody has to judge.
Somebody has to judge.
This is what intrigues me about the whole process. Somebody still has to spend the time to look at not only the products, not only
but the system,
the combinations. Yeah.
And I think our code mark system is something that has tried to step out into those judgments, but we are going to need sort of clearer and updated ways of making those judgments because new products are in the system and we're going to have to deal with that. What I said was forced upskilling, but a real need for education in the building sector to be able to use those products well, and people really wanting that information in the next couple of years as these new products come online and change the way that we build in New Zealand, I hope.
Because it's not just a moisture or a rain type system. You've also got to consider fire as well as structural. There's so many different areas. How do you tie them all into some way of understanding without going through the complexity of a code mark or a brand's appraisal?
And I think the New Zealand context around things like fire and earthquake are again something that those judgment calls have to be made with the values in mind. It's not just a technical task that we are asking ourselves to do. If we were to change some of those rules, we would need to be very clear-eyed about who those people are that we're making the decisions for. And any sort of deregulation around that, we have to think very carefully about. It's not a cost-benefit analysis. It's people's lives, it's people's safety, it's people's confidence and trust in the system and trust in their government. And so we have to get these things right. And we've not got a long time to do it before these products are online and available in the market.
Exactly.
Well, and technically all of these products are available and we have a process in place, and this is, we had some discussion about this last year. There's some challenges which already sit there and now they're being talked about, but they've been there.
That's true. This is a change that hopefully will invigorate some of this debate and drive some change in the industry. But yes, the availability of the products, the way that importers could access the system, we will need to watch and wait and see if this changes behaviour in the market.
Well, so I'm just thinking about we're a bit of a wrap up. So we've talked about a bit of instability around our whole building industry, maybe the economy general. What's the answer right now? Is it spend or save on social housing?
Great question. I think that now should be the time where the government is building housing for New Zealanders when we really need it, but also when our building construction sector is at an all-time low that, in terms of where it has been in the last 5 years and the level of decline that we're seeing now, I think this is a deeper drop than that experienced by the sector in the global financial crisis. We're losing more talent offshore this time. And so the rebuild from that is going to be very steep and quite painful. And now is an opportunity for the government to step in and create not only that work around building housing in projects that are, many of them are already planned. The work on the paperwork side of them is already done, the designs are there. So we could get spades in the ground pretty quickly for many of those projects And Kiwis need them. There is a real housing need out there in this cost of living crisis, and at a time where unemployment is affecting different parts of the country very differently. In Auckland, we're seeing an 8% unemployment figure there. So people are really struggling and needing these houses, and I would say that is a role for government there.
And did you have anything to do with the announcement that Minister Pink has just made, I think yesterday, about the release of, or the call for the release of the plan sets from Kaingaora, which did you have anything to do with that push?
I saw that, and I think we're going to see some more announcements there where we're looking for that kind of collaboration. But the things that I'm also working with him on are around liability at the council level, making sure we've got that mix right, but also on some of those long-standing challenges that the political parties have had disagreements on in the last 20 years around some of those rules which have been seen in the building sector for a long time as prohibitive. And that's where I think we're going to see some closer collaboration, I hope. But you'll have to watch and see.
Yeah. There are no other tidbits that you can give us that, that you're working, because it is good to hear that you're working alongside the Minister at the moment, and, that's a collaborative approach.
Yeah, I will offer you this. It's unusual to have blue team and a red team both having the nerdiest lawyers in the bunch as the building spokespeople, and I think we have both enjoyed getting into the technical detail on the building side and really trying to drive some positive change there. We're coming at this from different priorities, but the overall picture that we want to see, more homes, cheaper homes, warmer, drier, there's an opportunity here.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Great catching up. Sharing knowledge is at the heart of our strategy to make buildings better for everyone. Sign up for our podcasts to learn more about creating healthy living conditions by protecting building structures from external and internal moisture damage. Thanks for listening. Looking forward to having you with us next time.